Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Everyday Anarchism. This is another episode. It was originally supposed to be the last episode on the English Revolution, but now I'm thinking about doing things on Milton and Hobbes. It's gotten out of my control, I'm afraid. And the subject today is the Quakers, or perhaps we should say the early Quakers, the Quakers in the period of the English Revolution. And my guest is Kate Peters. Kate, thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's my absolute pleasure, and thank you very much for inviting me. It sounds like a really good project.
I've certainly been enjoying it very, very much. Let's just start with, can you tell us, before we get to sort of who the Quaker leaders are, I'm already tripping myself up, do we even get to talk about Quaker leaders, and their views, where they fit in the sort of arc of this narrative? So we have, these wars breaking out, multiple wars, multiple radical groups who sort of flourish and then sort of fade away or are put down at various times. And then it seems like, unlike all the other ones, the Quakers have endured. So I'll have to ask you about why that is. But first, just where do they fit in this sequence of events?
So the starting point for understanding the Quaker movement, lots of people locate it quite precisely to 1652. So a few years after the start of the regicide. And Quakers become visible in their printing, in their pamphleteering, in the north of England, in Yorkshire and in Lancashire, from a fairly specific point in about June 1652. But where they fit into the arc before then, and why they become visible at that point, I think you're absolutely right to think about the religious radicalism that has been generated by the experience of civil war. So we know that the Quakers who become apparent to us as historians tend to be based in separated churches, radical churches scattered across the north of England. So they're part of a society that has been experimenting with radical religion, if you like, has not been constrained by religious legislation since for a considerable number of years, since 1646 or so. And we know that radical religious ideas are flourishing. Specifically in terms of where they may have encountered those ideas. We know that I think one thing to say about the Quaker leaders, the people who are visible to us, who write pamphlets, who publish pamphlets, is that they're actually surprisingly young. And it's one of the things I remember encountering when I was studying them and thinking, actually, they're younger than I am. These people are 19, 20. And so they have grown up with the Civil War, but they haven't known very much before the Civil War. They haven't necessarily experienced the oppression of Laudian oppression in the 1630s. So I think they're a product of religious liberty. A fair number of them have served in the New Model Army. So we know that George Fox served in the New Model Army. And James Naylor served in the New Model Army. We know that he was at the Battle of Naseby, and he served as a quartermaster, I think, in John Lambert's regiment. So the army was understood to be an area where religious liberty was not only discussed and fought for, and in constitutional terms, they were arguing for the importance of liberty of conscience, but they also practiced liberty of conscience in a sense, in that they had their own preachers, and were a vehicle for spreading radical religious ideas. I think there are clearly links actually between the Putney debates and the debates over the agreement of the people and the Quakers. So the Putney debates were happening, as this great set piece debate between army leaders and parliamentarian leaders, army leaders, army grandees and some MPs, talking about a constitutional settlement after the king had been defeated in battle. And one of the great parts of the request, this constitutional request, the agreement of the people, was that people should not be constrained in their religion. They should have liberty of conscience. And the first, one of the early references to Quakers is to a set of women from overseas who are standing around outside, near the Putney debates, presumably, engaged in that debate. So although we think of them as coming from the north of England, actually the phrase Quaker, now we can actually look at the dates of, we can do text searches on pamphlets in a way that we couldn't even 10 years ago, I think. And it's clear that the phrase Quaker is used to reference religious radicalism and the manifestations of religious radicalism from about 1646, 1647, again associated with the army, associated with ecstatic worship of women and so on, and associated actually, interestingly, with the Navy as well. So we know that as a term, Quaker has been used during the course of the 1640s. We know that a lot of them have served in the New Model Army. In terms of, so when they become visible, if you like, in 1652, I think we might want to think about that as an archival beginning in a way. It's certainly when they start to print pamphlets, and it's when they get a centre, they get a focus for their organisation, for these itinerant preachers who are moving around the north of England, primarily George Fox, and he joins up with groups of seekers in Lancashire and Yorkshire, and the kind of the symbolic start of the Quaker movement is when he arrives at Swarthmore Hall in Lancashire, and that's the home of a gentlewoman, Margaret Fell, who is married to an independent-leaning judge. And Margaret Fell has this very famous conversion moment when she meets George Fox. And so they get a sort of organisational hub from which what looks like quite a sophisticated organisation, religious movement, is then coordinated. So that's sort of technically, practically where they come from. I can talk a little bit about their ideas, but tell me what else you need to know in terms of their origins and where they.
Yeah, that seems exactly right. I guess the only thing I'll say before I ask to tell you about the ideas is I'm struck by one of the ways to think about the English Civil War, this period, as an outbreak of anarchy, which is to say, not anarchism, the view that people can be, self-organizing. But anarchy, the idea that whatever was the established authority has been destroyed and there's sort of a vacuum. And probably the most famous expression of this comes from this man, Thomas Hobbes, who is in some ways the founder of many, if not most, of the concepts of mainstream political science, which is, we can think of him of looking at this anarchy and saying it has to be put back together, sort of in a sort of top-down way. This is the famous concept of the Leviathan. But what I'm hearing from you is the Quakers are in a certain way also a response to the anarchy. If the kind of religious oppression or rules-bound religion that the ranters were responding to, that some of the other Protestant groups were responding to, was the formation of their groups, these young Quakers were sort of raised without this set of rules, and so they were formulating their own. Is that an okay statement? I see it's not entirely okay.
No, it is entirely. But I think you can take that in two different ways. So, in one way, and there's a lot to say about this. I'll talk about this, I'm sure, a lot more. You're absolutely right. They're setting themselves. They set up almost an alternative church by virtue of the fact that it is that they keep tabs on each other. They are generating a nationally significant presence, if you like, both connecting with sympathetic congregations and generating new ones, trying to persuade people into a form of worship. But before we get on to that, actually, I'm glad you mentioned the ranters, because I think that it's perhaps not as anarchic in that sense as we might think.
I just need to say that's exactly what Nigel Smith said as well. So this is just the answer I'm going to get. I understand.
Excellent. Insofar as one of the earliest references, one of the ways we know about the early Quaker movement is through the journal of George Fox, who's understood to be the prime founder of the Quaker movement. And he keeps a journal which he, broadly speaking, writes in the 1670s while he's in prison. So it's a retrospective account. And he traces his origins, if you like, or his convincement to well before 1652. And we know that from other sources as well that George Fox he came from the Midlands and he went to Coventry in 1650. And he sounds from his journal as though he went to Coventry specifically because he knew there were ranters there, and the ranters had been arrested under the terms of the new Blasphemy Act. So the new Republican government was, formulating a whole, if not a constitution, then trying to set up a whole new state. Had the difficulty or the task, if you like, of trying to decide, of trying to resolve the question of organising a national church. So one of the earliest things that they did was made it. There was no obligation to go to a parish church. So in that sense, it looks quite tolerationist. But at the same time, they're terribly worried about blasphemy. So the Blasphemy Act is passed as it's almost as though, from the way Fox describes it in his journal, that they are using it as a test case to say, what authority do you have to tell us that what we're doing is blasphemous? What is your spiritual authority? Is it right, in other words, for the state to exert that sort of coercive control over something that is a matter of conscience and therefore should be free? And so George Fox goes and speaks to ranters imprisoned in Coventry jail, and records in his journal that they're dirty, ranting. He doesn't like them. But he then goes. We don't know. Again, we never know. This is one of the points Christopher Hill makes. We never really know why he's moved of the Lord. But anyway, he then travels to Derby and has an almost identical experience whereby he is arrested for blasphemy under the terms of the Blasphemy Act, and is actually then imprisoned for the following year, for a whole year. While he's in prison, we know he's making connections with other people who become Quakers, Elizabeth Hooton and Samuel Hooton and so on. So I think they are, and we see this later on in their campaigning in the 1650s, is that it is very much a dialogue with the state about the authority of the state to control people's conscience. So they're getting on with their own. They're absolutely doing this kind of local organisation. You see it manifesting itself in all sorts of interesting ways. Like if you imagine that the parish church system would have had a system of discipline for people who behave, who misbehave. It was the source of poor relief, of helping poor people. The Quakers in their organisation replicate that sort of organised. It's never quite organised, but they write down and they certainly leave letters where Quaker ministers will go and hear a case of theft and say, well, we must give the pears back to this person. So they're adjudicating over, if you like, misdemeanors that are not religious at all. I think probably they are, aren't they, in terms of moral terms? But they're adjudicating in a way that we might think a church court would have adjudicated. And similarly, looking after, organising themselves to levy money to look after their poor. So it looks in many ways like a parallel, maybe over egging it, but you can see ways in which it's a sort of parallel parochial system that they are doing entirely off their own bats.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm probably going to label that anarchism or sort of anarchistic, as in other words, if you're doing what the government would have done, but you're doing it in a grassroots way. At least that's what I'm interested in this show. But I'm not asking you to claim that it's anarchism. And I think we're I think that's fantastic, and we're ready to move on to maybe to Fox and his key ideas, if that's the place we should go next. But you're the expert.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, I mean, he's. I think the thing about Quaker ideas, and we'll call them Fox's ideas, um, and they are. There's no contestation over that. But lots of people are writing these ideas. I think the thing that if you like distinguishes the Quakers from some of the other radical sects that we know about, the fifth monarchists, and even the ranters, actually, and certainly, you know, some of the Baptists, is that the Quakers are not Calvinists, so that they are universalists, and that's in many, you know, so we can understand their origins as being very mystical. They've read Jacob Boehme. So they understand. They're very focused, or they're motivated by the idea of immediate revelation from God. But rather than that being a closing down theology in a way that it would be for Calvinists, where you're concerned about the elect, the chosen ones, in a sense, the universal nature of grace for them makes them, or enables them, to have a much more urgent message that they really can preach, not only nationally but actually very quickly internationally, as a message that will reach everybody. And for me, that's one of the most interesting. Again, I think that's a very interesting parallel when we're thinking about a national religion, because this is a way of thinking about God and people's relationship with God that potentially affects everybody. So it's inclusive rather than exclusive. So that's the sort of headline thing, the idea that I think differentiates them from some of the other sects. But otherwise, I think the authority of the immediacy of divine revelation above all else is the key defining element of Quaker religious thought, and that enables people to that manifests itself in ways that look very egalitarian. In that there is a rejection of worldly hierarchy. There's an expectation of spiritual equality, and an expectation that you should be governed by your conscience, by the light of Christ in your conscience above all else, and not by man-made, not by structures of the world, man-made structures. So in many accounts, historiographically of the Quakers, they are understood to be, and I think Christopher Hill talks about them actually, as having experienced the huge defeat, if you like, of the potential for radical revolution that we saw with the Levellers and with the Diggers in 1649. They are understood in that narrative to have almost to be in despair about the state of the new regime, the new parliamentarian regime, and they have no faith at all in man-made structures, man-made constitutions. So they're seen, and we see this subsequently in what we understand to be Quaker quietism, that they don't want to be politically. To be seen to be politically contentious, they want to be peaceable and to be their own people. So it's understood as certainly less politically sharp, if you like, than the fifth monarchists or than the Levellers, who obviously have constitutions and so on. Is that enough on that?
Yes, I think that's a great start. Since you mentioned the Diggers, I want to ask: is there anything there? Do we know anything about the fact that Winstanley became a Quaker, besides the fact that Winstanley became a Quaker, or is that the end of the story? Because if there's more to it, I'd love to hear it. But if there's not, I understand the records are sparse.
There's not very much. There are not very many records. I think they may have encountered each other at Kingston. I think Edward Burrough may have been at Kingston at the same time as Gerard Winstanley. I think the more likely link, to be honest, will be the literature, the printing. Because the publisher or the bookseller who oversaw the publishing of Joe Edwin Stanley's work was Giles Calvert, and Quakers pretty quickly take their material to be published at Giles Calvert's shop. And Giles Calvert's shop is understood to be a meeting point for Quakers. So you see from letters that they're saying, we're just going to go to Calvert's shop and then he'll tell us where to go. So in terms of networking, I think that's the most likely connection. So and we can assume that they've read Winstanley's work. There are many similarities, I think, spiritually, I think, with what he's saying.
Right, and I guess that takes us just perfectly to what you were just saying about the political quietism. If Winstanley was a political revolutionary, even if he sort of he wanted to be in some ways outside of the system, but the digging on the wasteland was a great political statement, and so it makes sense if that political route is closed, but the theologies and some of the larger views are similar, then the Quakers are the going concern for someone who has roughly Winstanley's ideas and wants to continue with those ideas without without coming into conflict again with Fairfax and Cromwell. So that just sounds like, from what you're describing, that it's just like what you've said and what we know about what happens to Winstanley just flows together. That's the place for him to go if he has his ideas but no longer wants to be making this political commune, I guess.
Exactly. And I think the year or so gap between the actions of the diggers, the kind of the last hurrah of the levellers, and the sort of the beginnings, if you like, or the visibility of the Quakers, is quite an important couple of years. In that there has clearly been significant repression, and the army has clearly, in that sense, won. There is a defeat. Christopher Hill's right. So perhaps the Quakers have lost, if not the taste, then the sense that there's anything here that can be achieved. So there's certainly no evidence that I have encountered of communal of thinking about how this might attach to a different mode of production, to digging, occupying common land. They are very clear about, that they have moments of campaigning on things like tithes. So they're very clear that people should not pay tithes, which is not at all the same as Winstanley, but there are sort of, they've got campaigning strategies, if you like, to register their dissent from some of the things that the Commonwealth and then later on the Protectorate government are up to.
Okay, is this a good place to talk about gender? Because it seems like, in terms of, if you're removing the traditional structures of authority and instead doing individual revelation, well, all the traditional structures of authority, starting with the king and the aristocracy, as well as the Catholic priesthood, but even going into the new model army and Presbyterian organization, these are all still male-dominated forms of authority. And it seems like the Quakers, of course, Rachel Foxley talked a great deal about the women who were in the Leveller movement, although there was also disputes about how much those were those ideas or whether they're being used as pawns. That's a historiographical question that I'll just refer people to the Rachel Foxley interview if they haven't listened to it yet. But it's clear that that women's voices and ideas matter in the Quaker movement. And so can you tell us how the ideas lead to this and what that means for the Quakers of this era?
So I think there's a lot going on in the 1640s and 1650s. And before we get to the Quakers, I think in a sense, very symbolically, the patriarchal order has been significantly challenged by the execution of the king, and that was such a mainstay to ideas of patriarchal order that we can't ignore that. And it's clear that certainly Levellers, but there are other women who begin to write. I think the absence of the breakdown of censorship from 1641 onwards obviously means that there is a huge explosion of material being printed. And the content of that printing is unprecedentedly, it's unregulated in many ways. So the Quakers are not the only. There are other women who have started publishing in ways that perhaps wouldn't have been seen before. And we know from the work of Anne Hughes that there are big shifts in the ways in which people talk about gender identity and patriarchal roles. So even the division between how royalists use patriarchal language and how parliamentarians use patriarchal language, we can see it. So there's something going on, I think, in terms of unleashing a lot of very gendered language to talk about the loss of order. And it's clear that there's a fear of very, politically active, very, mouthy women that is quite intensified. And as we've said, I think that the key to we know that women are involved in the separated churches, so they've got an unusual amount of authority there. Again, because these are churches that are fairly, they are fairly freestanding. They don't have, they're not trammeled by the doctrines of the Church of England, and so women have taken on positions of leadership in Baptist churches and so on. We know that that's going on. There's a lot of fear about it, but we also know that they are actually kind of doing it. So and as we've said, I think the key spiritual element of Quakers that lends itself to women speaking is this idea of universal grace and spiritual equality. So they take the line from the scripture that your sons and your daughters will prophesy as the justification. Women are more or are open to the word of God in all sorts of ways that can still be quite gendered, that there's nothing else going on in their heads. They're already meek and mild and so on. So they're able to be receptive to the word of God. So there's theologically, it makes sense for them to be doing it. In terms of the lack of regulation, it makes sense for them to be preaching. In terms of what women, how that manifests. Well, there's Margaret Fell is obviously an important figure, and she's got within Quaker historiography, she's a mother of Quakerism, and clearly has a vast amount of authority with the Quakers that she's keeping in touch with her correspondence. So the correspondence that she keeps is a great source for understanding the early Quaker movement. And Quaker ministers write to her with enormous reverence, actually, and so she has a lot of personal authority within that, through that. And there are just women preachers. They are just there, and they are using the same mechanisms that the Quakers, kind of organisationally, the Quakers have got a system they raise money from local congregations, and they use that money to fund their ministry. So it's a parallel, if you like, to tithes. This is, they're consenting to their own ministry and they're paying for it. And women are enabled, therefore, to travel quite long distances. They're part of these itinerant ministers. They are able, in that sense, to have a public role within the Quaker movement, simply because they've got the material means to do that. And they also keep in touch with Margaret Fell and call her, you are the nursing mother. So I don't know if we can say that they're specifically inspired by her, but they clearly some of them have a very close relationship with them. And I think, like some of the male Quaker preachers, the women Quaker preachers behave in very similar ways, in that they head out on an itinerant preaching mission, moved by the Lord. They get some money from Margaret Fell to travel. They may travel in pairs, but they do exactly the same as Quaker men doing. When they will arrive in a town, they will go to a parish church. They will challenge the authority of the parish minister to say, what is the derivation of your authority? They will challenge the authority of the magistrate to be arresting. By what right do you coerce me for my beliefs? So they're all the time testing this idea of liberty of conscience, which I think, by the way, gets more interesting in terms of what you're thinking about anarchism, is more interesting after December 1653, because in December 1653 we get the instrument of government, the Protectorate, is a new constitutional arrangement with Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector, and with a written constitution, and the religious clauses of that constitution guarantee. I mean, they allow for religious liberty of conscience, that people will not be compelled to any religion, but will be protected in their religion as long as they're not breaking the peace. So to that extent, I think they are absolutely in touch with, constitutionally, the sort of the political power structures and the religious power structures, and are testing them and saying, but your job as magistrate is to protect me in my liberty of conscience. And I think it's very interesting that women do that as easy, not in as great as not in as many numbers, but actually in remarkable numbers, that they're doing exactly the same, if you like, technique as they carry their ministry into new areas. So that's one answer for gender spiritual equality. But I think a little bit, actually, like the Levellers, there is still lots of evidence that Quaker women are also slightly constrained by male Quaker ministers. So there's quite a lot of anxiety, precisely because of misogynistic expectations of whether women should be in the public sphere, and also almost the reputational damage that preaching women will do to the Quaker movement. So you see great anxieties expressed between male ministers, saying, well, I don't know, Dorothy Howgill, she's preaching in Colchester, and she's saying she's alienating people because they think she's an evil spirit and things. So they try and constrain what women can do. And they write to Margaret Fell, say, we really need more Quaker ministers here, but please don't send any more women, because it's very upsetting, and these people have an evil spirit in them. So all of the if you like, the stock ideas we have about ways in which women were perceived in the 17th century as unruly and dangerous, we can still see that actually in the private letters of the Quaker movement. So on the one hand, it's amazing they're publishing, they're preaching, they've got the spiritual justification for what they're doing, but the pragmatics of the Quaker management, if you like, is like, well, they're a bit of a risk, actually. So they're still 17th century in that sense.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and that element of it is unfortunately not surprising. I guess you also cleared up something else for me, in the sense of, like, there's clearly a difference between women preaching and women prophesying, because a prophetess, I guess is the word, is in some ways not speaking on her own authority, not out of her knowledge, not out of her revelation, but as some sort of revelation that has possessed her. And so she occupies this weird place in the public sphere and not in the public sphere, but you're not meant to think that she's smart, just that she's touched, I suppose. And so a woman preacher is in some ways almost the inverse of the prophetess, because she is speaking from her own knowledge and experience. Do I have that right?
Yes, and I think they would see themselves as prophets. I think their justification for speaking is absolutely that this is divine revelation from God, and that is their authority. So I'm calling them preachers, but that's actually me being a bit lazy. I think they would all describe themselves as prophets.
But the reason why there's anxiety around Quaker female prophets that you wouldn't have around, I mean, there's the history of female prophets in England is a long one, but it's clearly a different thing. The other female prophets don't necessarily challenge the idea of male clerical authority, and these women do.
Yes, as do the men. The men are also do the idea of so it's not so they do actually. Then I mean, what's interesting about the women, the female ministers, these itinerant ministers, people like Anne Audland, Mary Howgill, that they Priscilla Cotton, that they travel and they get into trouble with magistrates, which is what all Quakers do. And I think they're actually that it's deliberate, that they are absolutely trying to test the boundaries of where liberty of conscience is, how it's going to be policed. But of course, the women are attacked on grounds of their gender, and they do get pleasingly cross about this in pamphlet literature. So the judge says, you should be at home sweeping the floor. And they respond. So there's a whole series. There's a whole series of pamphlets, of tracts of writing, both by men and by women, saying, actually, here are the scriptural justifications for women speaking. Here is scriptural precedent for female prophets, for women speaking justified. And of course, Margaret Fell, after the Restoration in 1666, writes this very famous book called Women Speaking Justified and Allowed for in Scripture. So absolutely making the case for the importance of immediate revelation in whatever gender, but also that women are likely to be less worldly, less compromised by worldly hierarchy, and therefore it will be, it's a pure message from God. And you see, I mean, Margaret Fell's book is very, very famous, but you see it coming from 1655, and it comes out of obviously gendered conflicts in courtrooms and in churches about whether or not women have the authority to speak. So yeah, that's one of the things I like about the Quakers, is they nail that as well, of like, I do have a right to be doing this, and here it is.
All right, fascinating. Okay, I think one more thing about sort of the Quaker ideas and the practices, and then we can move towards the back end and sort of resolve them in this period, which is I'm curious about. So in my limited knowledge of Quaker organization today, there's two crucial things that make them different. First is the lack of an obvious hierarchy, especially a wider hierarchy. So I come from a Presbyterian tradition where each congregation has a certain amount of control, but also there's a sort of Congress. That's what Presbyterian means. Obviously, if you're familiar with Catholic or Episcopalian, aka Anglican, there's a hierarchy that's really identical to a military hierarchy, a commander who just, his authority carries down through the system. And then even if you have an independent church, there is, in my experience, in my knowledge, outside of Quakers, almost always a hierarchy of the speaker in the congregation. There is a primary speaker or leader, and the Quakers, at least as I understand, do not have these hierarchies. So I'm curious, to what extent was this the case, this Quakerism as we understand it now in the 1650s? Do we see these practices then, or do they develop later?
They develop later. So we can talk about that in the 1660s, of how it does develop. I think how it develops, or how it is practiced in the 1650s, is Quakers talk about other meetings. There's a meeting, in Whitby, or there's a meeting in Swannington, and they don't talk about them being leaders. I think they talk about them having hosts, actually. So it is all about it's a network of people who are supportive, and meetings will obviously mainly be in people's private houses. Sometimes they're in inns, but usually it's in people's private houses. So they know the groupings of meetings, as I say, is geographical and based on knowing somebody who is supportive or safe or convinced. And there's a very pragmatic way in which the Quaker ministers. So when I'm talking about the Quaker ministers, there's within the Quaker scholarship, they're called the first publishers of truth, and you can count. There's sort of maybe 70, but that's a biblical number. There's 100 or so people who've kind of tried to count who they are. So the first publishers of truth are sort of de facto the itinerant ministers. These are the people in touch with Margaret Fell, moving around the country. You can see a fairly organised campaign from a national preaching campaign from in August 1654, and that's not any old date. That's the date that the elections to the first Protectorate Parliament are being held. So the first time we see a sort of sustained presence of Quakers in London is outside the first Protectorate Parliament in 1654. So they're building up a national network. And pragmatically, there are letters between these ministers, all kept and funneled through Margaret Fell, and they have, I think we might say, they discern godliness. So they recommend to people that, the baker in Madcock is very godly, and he's understood spiritually. He's got good leanings in him. So they've got a sort of a checklist of people that in whom they discern the light of Christ, and as being sort of like them. So it's never expressed as hierarchy. It's and of course the power to discern the inner light in people is an extraordinary power, but is God given. Anybody can have it in a sense. So there is a marking out of people who are supportive, who would be leaders in that sense. And there is also, and again, we can see gender dynamics in this. There is also, letters of great alarm when they see when it becomes apparent that people have fallen from the light, that they're no longer operating with the light of Christ in them. And the big crisis that occurs in that genre, if you like, is James Naylor, who is seen to have fallen from the light and is therefore no longer preaching the word of God, and it becomes a huge crisis within a very famous crisis within the movement. And they write to each other, discerning, godly leanings, or the fact that people have lost the light, have turned away from the light of Christ. So they have got a sort of checklist. There are some regulations circulated by a Quaker called William Dewsbury. Again, he's been in the army quite early on in 1653 to talk about exactly what a meeting should do if they have somebody there who they feel is not godly. So you see the beginnings of a sort of group discipline, arrangements for either removing somebody from a meeting or talking to them and urging them back to the light and things. And there is a great fluidity in the 50s. Again, I've seen it with ranters. So although in public, the ranters are very, they don't want any, the ranters are filthy. They're also having very extensive debates with ranter meetings and trying to urge the ranters to discern the light of Christ and so on. And that's what I mean about, I think universal grace is such an important feature in everything, in the way they approach discipline, and who could be in their church and who couldn't be. They were always trying to persuade people. So there's not a very clear meeting structure at all. But as I say, there are hand notes by William Dewsbury about how best to behave. It's increasingly clear that George Fox and, until he falls from grace, James Naylor have got this sort of authority within the movement. So if somebody is preaching, is discerned to not be preaching the word of Christ anymore, they will, they turn to people like Fox or Margaret Fell or Naylor to offer them some, to talk to them, to offer them some sort of guidance. So it's very, very informal, but you can see it pragmatically working, if you like. And then, speaking of pragmatism, I think the Quaker organisation that is established in the 1660s is understood to be a response, actually, to the experience of oppression that the Quakers experience, very severe oppression that they do experience at the Restoration, and this is the moment where the Quaker movement is deemed to have become quietist. In that they announce their pacifism, they announce that they will never fight the king, as an obvious kind of pragmatic statement of self-protection, and the meetings also is a form of self-protection. So they are, especially after the experience of James Naylor, which we can see as a absolute turning point in the Quaker movement, there is increasing concern to control the enthusiasm, the unruly enthusiasms that can get people into trouble. So you see much more discipline emerging in the context of the repression of the Restoration.
Right. So the charismatic elements, the elements that made them resemble the ranters, have to be removed in the Restoration, because the religious regime is not the same as it was under Charles I, but it's certainly not Cromwell's protectorate toleration anymore.
It's certainly not, and there's specifically anti-Quaker legislation that the repression of dissenters from 1662 throughout the 1660s is really quite harsh. There are literally thousands of Quakers imprisoned, in the space of a week, and many of the leaders actually die in prison. So it does look extremely harsh, in the 1660s. And that's how I understand, anyway, the formation of a sort of church discipline. There's some interesting moments where Quakers are deemed to have turned ranter. So John Perrot is one, where they have a debate again in the 1660s about wearing hats, and should there be a regulation about taking your hat off or wearing a hat, or should you keep your hat on if should you be just moved by the Lord? And increasingly, figures like Fox and Fell are trying to regulate it so they don't get tarred with a ranter brush.
Okay, so the question I was moving towards was sort of a combination of what happened to the Quakers, and how is it that they, that we still have Quakers, whereas we don't have ranters or Muggletonians for that matter. But it sounds like you've at least begun the answer here, that they have a different, they both change their practices and sort of accept a pulling back from the political world. It's almost a post revolutionary form of radical Protestantism, as opposed to a revolutionary form of radical Protestantism. If I'll try that out, and you can tell me what you think.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way of thinking about it, actually. I think the continuity between, if you like, the 1650s and the 1660s is precisely that the reason they are seen as troublemakers in the 1650s as well as in the 1660s is that they are really pushing government authorities and religious authorities on the rights and wrongs of religious, any form of religious coercion. So they, I'm trying to think where I'm going with this.
You can take a second.
An argument you can have with that's an argument you can have with the Restoration government, and it's an argument you can have with a Republican government. It's just that where the line is drawn has changed very significantly. So in that sense, although I think I do think what is interesting about the Quakers in the 1650s is that they are actually quite engaged politically. If we look at who they're speaking to, it looks like if not a negotiation, then it's a protest against the legal parameters of what of religious reform in the 1650s. You can see ways in which that is replicated in the 1660s. They're still protesting against it, but they absolutely withdraw from it. I think there is no hope, in a sense, of expecting to change it. One of the things that I think is interesting about the Quakers in the 1650s is they retain very interesting links with the army, and historians don't think enough, I don't think, about the power. Well, they do think about the power of the army in the 1650s, but as a sort of the ubiquity of the army is usually seen, for obvious reasons, as not the strong point, if you like, of the Republican moment, that it uses military power in ways that are very clearly very repressive. The Quakers are in with the army all the way through. So the other network that they use is army garrisons. They go to army garrisons to preach. So there is a huge continuity actually between the 1640s and the 1650s in terms of, I think, the Quakers understanding the army as the the origin of liberty of conscience and a constitutional resolution of liberty of conscience. So they're continuing to do that lobbying throughout the 1650s. So I have a view of the Quakers, which is that they're not as divorced from politics as we might think. We just need to remember that the army is part of that political order, I think. Whereas in the 1660s, there is a clearer sense that we all we can do is continue to practice in the way that we do, but below the radar. There's less. Although actually, I'm arguing against myself here. If we look at people like William Penn, of course he is negotiating with the king. People, the Quakers are going to see Charles II very, very early on in 1660 to talk to him about religious provision. So they do sustain that political dialogue. But I think you're right. The organisation that they develop enables them to survive below the radar, if you like.
Okay, and then as opposed to along with the other radical Protestants who want a more revolutionary mindset, or presumably more involved in politics, the place to go is across the ocean, which is why we have New England and Pennsylvania as places. And I'll try and remember, listeners, to post William Penn's do we call it a constitution? I can't remember, but his governing document for Pennsylvania, and you will be astonished at how much it resembles some of the American founding documents. You'll also be astonished at how much it resembles some of the ideas of the levelers. It really is a Protestant political document that's astonishing. I'm sorry, I cut you off, Kate. Go right ahead.
No, absolutely. And the other person who does it before William Penn, there's another Quaker called Edward Billing, who is a leveler, and I can never remember if it's West Jersey or East Jersey, but he has a similar kind of land holding, where the constitution he has there is extremely close to the agreement of the people, actually, and he goes before Penn. So I think you're absolutely right. That's one of the places they go in order to. I mean, they're going everywhere. Actually, they go to Barbados in 1655. They're already in New England in the 1650s. But absolutely, I think the setting up of constitutions is a moment for the Restoration.
Wonderful. All right. We've hit everything that I wanted to get to, Kate. So now it's just to ask you: is there anything else you want to make sure that you share?
That's a good question. I think the only thing I would point to really is, rather than having this sort of I think one of the interesting moments for the Quakers is 1659 at the point, so we can understand them as being somehow disengaged from worldly politics, and engaged purely in running a church, a set of meetings for like-minded people. But in 1659, just before the restoration of the monarchy, they are highly organised. There's the moment where they are clearly lobbying the army, and they're attending army meetings. They're attending army council meetings. They are reissuing versions of if not the agreement of the people, and some of the revolutionary documents from 1648. So there is a moment of urgency in 1659 where I think the Quakers do switch to that. I think at that point they think they have half a chance of reinvigorating the argument for religious liberty of conscience, and the speed with which they do it, the alacrity with which they do it, and just the scale of the movement is really, really impressive. So in terms of, I think one of the things the Quakers are really interesting to understand is just the scale of communication, the scale of potential mobilization. And we do tend to see the 1650s as a sort of decline towards failure. But they really minded in 1659, and they moved very, very fast to see if there was one chance of getting, again, the army to offer a constitution. So I think I have I think they are less apolitical, I think, than some historians would have us believe. And I do think that there's a way in which you can argue that they're obviously sort of depoliticized stance is a security device, a smoke screen for what looks like quite interesting networking. So and as we've said, Winstanley is a Quaker, Lilburn is a Quaker. I think there are debates going on all the way through the 1650s. It's not necessarily a narrative of quietism uninterrupted.
That's fantastic. That excuse me. That goes right into what I wanted to say, because I had the medieval historian Eleanor Yoniga on the show talking about it on a different topic, but she had a good little one-liner that was something like, we wasted our revolution on Puritans or something like that. And believe me, as someone who was raised in a Calvinist home, I'm familiar with the war on Christmas and all of the reasons to hate the Puritans, but I have been so struck throughout this series of conversations, which is coming to, if not the end, at least an end with this conversation here. Maybe I'll do some other stuff, like I said, with people like Hobbes, with the way that the Protestant Reformation and the radical element of the Protestant Reformation was not just the political driver of this moment, but the ideas that we can start with Hobbes, right? The ideas that we call the Enlightenment are a series of responses to the political element of a lot of these religious ideas. And this idea of a secular Enlightenment that comes in the 18th century, fine, you can have it if you want, but I'm more inclined to say that it's in fact a politico-religious movement from the 16th and 17th centuries that continues to drive so many of the ways we think about society, politics, and economics. And we might claim them to not be religious now, but to the people in the 17th and 18th century, they were clearly religious. And this has just been a fascinating journey for me through these ideas.
Great. No, I've enjoyed it as well. So thank you very much for all of the questions you've asked, because it's made me think.
Hello, everyone. This is Graham. Sorry to break in on that conversation. I just wanted to tell you that Kate and I chatted a bit about what it would really mean to think of the Quakers as anarchists after we finished our recording. Oops, my bad. So I actually invited Kate to come back on, just like with Bernard Kapp, and chat for a few more minutes about this. What you're about to hear is that extension of our conversation.
All right, so we're resuming this talk because after we finished our official formal interview, and we were just oh my, I'm sorry, I have to stop. Who is that on your mug? I see like a 7.
It's a mug from my son, and it's got a picture of Oliver Cromwell, and it says "hero" or "villain," and I've spent so long boring them with the English Revolution, but he thought this is a kind of an excellent example of bad history on a mug.
Well, I mean, oh no, it's bad that you just said, it's bad for me that you just said bad history, because I have just finished talking to Bernard Kapp about this sort of question, hero or villain, because I started off with this series with Cromwell as a sort of stock generic Napoleon figure, and he has emerged over the course of many conversations as perhaps the most liberal of all of the people who did have a chance to use violence to impose their vision. Not that he didn't use violence to impose his vision, but of the people who did use violence to impose their vision, he was perhaps the most liberal one, if that makes sense.
I think that sort of makes sense. But yeah, it depends how you define liberal. But he clearly thought about it very, very hard. And I don't like the way, but I note the way he talks about, the strength of the Navy is based actually on popular consent of Parliament, and therefore, with the backing of the people's consent, they can go and do what they like in Jamaica. So the tail end of it is worrying, but the spirit is astonishing.
Yes, and of course the bowels of Christ, which I think John Morrill and I didn't end up discussing or just barely mentioned. This idea that there is uncertainty is not always found in all Puritans. They're all looking for providence, but some of them are more sure that they have found it in their personal lives than others, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. No, that's true. That's true. So he remains open, doesn't he? And I think that's really interesting.
And that's where I will, if I'm holding him up as a sort of, I mean, this just keeps coming up. John Morrill was, saying this is really sort of a question, and Bernard Capto a bit of like, how does one, once one gets the revolution and is in power, and then one discovers that, quote, the people aren't quite on board with their own freedom and the utopia that one is leading the people into, how does one convince or coerce the people into their own freedom and prosperity? And compared to the legacy, the sort of Robespierre, Lenin, Napoleon legacy that I wanted to slot Cromwell in, he comes off as much less coercive in his vision than so many of those figures. Although I'm not asking you to have an opinion on Robespierre, I understand that's not your job.
Yeah, but no, interest. I do. Yes, exactly. And once you've got, I do think a key distinctive aspect of this period is once there is a constitution in place, it's a very different framework from what there had been previously. So it is a rare moment where there is a sort of constitutional framework that does define things like liberty and so on. And Cromwell is absolutely at the heart of that constitution. So I agree. There's more. It's much more interesting than pure brute force or messianic leadership or something like that. He's clearly not Machiavellian. He's clearly not sort of just seeking power for power's sake. But I know nothing about Robespierre, so I will stop there.
Okay, very good. Back off the mug, even though that was perfect. What I was saying was, you and I started chatting about anarchism afterwards, and I realized that I had not, done my job of asking you if the Quakers were anarchists, because the reason why I had you on was to find out if the Quakers were anarchists. But then the tricky bit is, I didn't want to put you in the spot of defining a 19th century political theory and extending it back several hundred years.
Indeed.
So let me try and do what I did with Ariel Hession when we started all this with Winstanley, and try and explain what struck me about the Quakers as anarchists, and you can tell me if I've got it right. So obviously, first of all, an anarchic vision is going to have as little hierarchy as possible, and that means both, you can think of it as like a broad hierarchy in terms of a whole bunch of things stacking upon one another. If you think about the military, or of course, universities or corporations, everyone sort of has, maybe there's a community of equals somewhere, but then above them is a boss, and then above them is another boss, and then above them is another boss, and then no matter how high you get, there's always more and more levels. That's the first thing. So the independent churches are missing that kind of hierarchy, episcopacy, we could say. And then also within the whatever you want to call it, the church service or the meeting, even in an independent church, you have a very clear hierarchy. Someone is in charge, the reverend, the pastor, etc. And we glanced on this in our previous conversation, but if you could have a meeting that neither has a hierarchy outside of that meeting nor within that meeting, it strikes me that you're doing something pretty anarchistic. So have I described the Quaker meeting effectively?
I that works for me, and I do think the key ingredient that distinguishes Quakers from some of the other radicals is that they are they're not Calvinists. So they believe that the light of Christ is potentially in everybody, And that means that although they probably, many of them did come from, having experienced separatist churches in the 1630s and 1640s, which were where churches were claiming the right to gather separately from the main church. By the time the Quakers became visible, if you like, there was no national church. So they're not looking to separate and to have their own tiny congregation. They potentially can go out and persuade everybody about the light of Christ that is equally, potentially spiritually present in everybody. So it's not just a lack of hierarchy. It's based on a fundamental idea about spiritual equality and spiritual egalitarianism. That is at odds, it's absolutely at odds with any kind of hierarchy of the church. So it's a very, very radical articulation of the priesthood of all believers. But absolutely, having removed the Calvinism, it's the Calvinism that they dislike in the ranters. It's the Calvinism they dislike in the army. It's the idea that they're not looking for a single congregation to meet with electing its own minister, which is a token of sort of, if you like, independency, that they can choose their minister. The way a minister becomes apparent, a Quaker preacher, speaker becomes apparent, is that they are moved by the Lord to speak. So what people are doing in a way is listening to God speak through whomever God decides to speak through at a particular moment. So there's a spontaneity to it that is crucial. Yeah.
Go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, the famous problem with anarchist meetings is that no one is in charge and anyone can talk. So I actually have never been to a Quaker meeting, but I don't have the sense that it has that sort of problem of cacophony. But it nevertheless doesn't have someone who is at the center or the front or above who speaks, and in that sense, it seems quite anarchist. I don't know. The Quakers generally descend into cacophony. What's the Milton term? Pandemonium.
So I've never been to a noisy Quaker meeting. It's true, and in fact, silence is another subversion. Mm-hmm. It's a very important symbolism of silence. Is again, you're leaving space in theory for people to listen to their consciences, and I think conscience is quite important in terms of individuality, if you like. So they're not going to be led by what they would call man-made preaching, but people allowing people to be led by their conscience. So the celebration of silence in a meeting is part of that celebration of a lack of hierarchy, that you don't have to speak if there's no need to speak. I'm sure there were cacophonous meetings. I'm sure if you read the letters, there's all sorts of evidence of people being a bit cross. But what is interesting, I think, about the Quakers is that I get the sense, certainly in the kind of the practical ways in which their meetings work, is that you get what I think later on they're called weighty Quakers, who clearly have more authority in various ways. So there's no formal recognition of their authority, but there seems to be quite a lot of social and economic recognition of their authority. And that's for me quite clear in these. There's a kind of set of Quaker ministers who have gone down in Quaker history as the first ministers of truth. And those were the people, men and women, mainly men, but an astonishing number of women for the time, who were funded by the Quakers. So they organised money raising to send them on preaching missions. So they're recognised as being effective speakers. They're not called preachers; they're called speakers, but they're recognised as being very effective public speakers. And as being able to sort of enlighten their audiences to the word of God. So there are sort of practical hierarchies that you see emerging in terms of who's good at this. But that's absolutely, and again, that's backed up. I think one of the things that's quite interesting about the Quakers is that is all facilitated by, if you like, an ongoing assumption of consent. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that Quakers do, a lot of radicals do, is argue for the abolition of tithes as an imposition where people are being forced against their conscience, against their will, to give money to the national church to pay for a preaching ministry that they don't wish to have anything to do with. So they're very clear that they will not pay tithes, but what they also say is that their own ministers are paid for by voluntary donations, and they will only raise the money for those donations if people like what they, if they are effective ministers and have got sort of the backing. So there's an implicit degree of consent, if you like, in how people are chosen, how people are funded to go off on their preaching ministry. So as I say, there are practical ways in which there's a sort of a hierarchy, but it is it's consensual, and B, it's not at all theoretical, if you like. The theory is egalitarianism.
Yeah, no, this is fantastic because there's a sort of, cheap misunderstanding of anarchism, where people say like, haha, how can there be anarchist leaders? How can Kropotkin be the anarchist leader? That means, he's not an anarchist. But the simple answer is that he was an anarchist leader because anarchists liked his ideas and supported him and flocked to him. He was never the head of an anarchist organization. He had no power to fire anyone or set any agendas or that sort of thing, but his mission, so to speak, was supported. And then when he supported the Russian military in World War I, the anarchists stopped supporting him. There was no lining up behind the leader because he was the leader and he said so. He was no longer the leader on that issue because in this democratic egalitarian way, the support which had made him, had given him this, you could say, unofficially hierarchical position, just flowed away from him. And obviously history is filled with politicians and generals and corporate leaders who make unpopular decisions that people don't like, but they back that decision anyway because they just say, oh, well, this is the boss and we have to do it, even though we don't agree with it. And it seems to me that the anarchists and the Quakers share that we will unofficially, democratically, leaders will emerge, if that makes sense.
No, that makes absolute sense. And they're clearly, so the ways in which that is funded underpins the idea that there are some people who are recognised to be good ministers. There's also a process by which some ministers are recognised not to be good, and there's a process for removing them. And there's the very, very early letter by Richard Hubberthorne in 1653 has got sort of speculative rules for how to behave at a meeting and the circumstances under which somebody could be asked to leave a meeting. So it's not, although there is the light of Christ is potentially within everybody, it's not always in everybody all of the time, and bad spirits can be removed. But again, there's a process of which I think amounts to implicit consent, of certainly of localized rules, which I think is quite useful. So it's up to a local meeting to resolve their differences. And if they can't handle it, then they go to some of the national ministers who are preaching quite a homogenous set of ideas about what Quaker worship should be like. So they kind of call in the big guns, if you like, once a local meeting hasn't sorted out its problems. But what's astonishing about that is that those are kind of rules for meetings, if you like, circulating quite early on, 1653. So before the sort of the Restoration period, where there's a much clearer church structure imposed. This is sort of work. It seems to me this is guidelines on how to get your local communities working effectively for the purposes of Quaker worship.
Yeah, this is, again, astonishingly similar to so much of the work done in, the sort of anarchist organizing guidelines. People are always publishing guidelines on how to get your local anarchist community going. And I think this brings me to the only other thing that I wanted to make sure that we talked about, that we spoke a little bit off the air, is one of the great questions or challenges of anarchist organizations is when you decide someone is bad and wrong and not doing what they are supposed to do, what do you do about them? The person who I label the first anarchist or first anarchist communist, Gerard Winstanley, he comes to the conclusion eventually, I've spoken about this with almost everyone, that everything should be non-coercive and wonderful, and then he comes to the conclusion that you should arrest and indeed execute the people who are bad. And once that's when you fall into the Robespierre category. I will now mention Robespierre started off as a stringent opponent of the death penalty. He's best known now for the guillotine, but that's not where he got frustrated. Come on, guys, we're trying to do the revolution here. I guess we have to kill people. It seems like Winstanley went down that path. So how did the Quakers, because they do not ever seem to have gone down this path into violent coercion, so how did they handle this problem?
So that's a good question. I think when we spoke before, I may have mentioned an instance of a Quaker minister called Richard Farnworth, who was a very key author, and again was an itinerant minister. And they had sort of beats where they would go back to different meetings and repeat, so they got to know different meetings, on a national, sometimes on an international level. And there's a moment where Richard Farnworth went to Lincolnshire in October 1656 or November 1656 and held what looked like a bishop's court, an ecclesiastical court, to say, you've been stealing apples and you've been, bad mouthing somebody, exactly the sorts of things that would be regulated by the church. And again, there was, but the outcome was for Richard Farnworth to, if you like, to adjudicate, but there was no coercion at the end of it. There was no fining. There was a system of giving the apples back or apologising for the bad mouthing. So on a very, very localized level, they resist that sense of that there's no coercion. But again, that's about how they organise themselves, if you like, religiously. I'm just trying to think more broadly about what they say in relationship to state coercion, though, because I think one of the ways in which the Quakers, in my view, have been unnecessarily depoliticized. They're seen as so spiritual. They're the sort of the equivalent of the 1960s hippies, in a sense. They're disengaged. They're not interested in they're not interested in constitutional politics in that sense. And I think the problem with that is that we forget that the starting point of the Quakers is that they become visible when there is already a constitution. They've had the revolution. Many of the Quakers were actually in the army, and they carried on actively being members of the army and actively discussing with the army the best way to preserve religious liberty of conscience. So what they do say about coercion in relation to the state is that the state has a duty to uphold liberty of conscience. So if the Quakers are imprisoned unfairly, the magistrate who has imprisoned them or the minister who has fined them should be punished by the state. They're very clear about that. If another example is they think ballad sellers are clearly peddling terrible religious falsehoods, and they also should be fined. They should not be allowed to do that. So where the state does have coercive capacity is when the people, members of society, are seen to be impeding the religious liberty of anybody, of Quakers or of anybody else. But they're doing that within the framework of the instrument of government that absolutely says people should not be compelled to worship, but should be protected in their worship. So they do see a role for state intervention, but not a role that involves death penalties. But perhaps that's because they're not talking at this, they're not coming up, they're not proposing a constitution. They are simply at this point lobbying for the constitution they've had to be upheld with integrity. If that does that make sense?
Yes, that makes absolute sense, and my understanding is part of the legacy of the Quakers. I can't remember if this was something that you and I had talked about or I talked about with someone else, but part of the legacy of the Quakers was to continue radicalism without an explicit challenge to the Constitution. And so it makes sense that a Quaker polity might come up with a very different set of rules, but if they are, rendering unto Caesar and working within the existing polity, then that sounds reasonable enough to me, I guess. If that, I don't know why I sound like I'm judging the Quakers.
Yeah,
I don't mean to.
The moment, I think there's a very interesting moment in 1659, 1660, when the Protectorate Parliament, that constitution, or the Protectorate the constitution has fallen, and the Rump Parliament was reinstated in May 1659. And there's a moment there where the Quakers clearly are lobbying the army, and they take the army straight back to the principles of 1647, 48, 49, straight back to what the army signed up to do in the Whitehall debates, what the army or the levellers, requested, were lobbying for in 1648 in terms of religious liberty of conscience, saying, look, this is why this is when you are on the right tracks. Do not turn your back on liberty of conscience. So, insofar as they see the army as clearly see the army as the legitimate instrument, if you like, of the revolution and the guardian of religious liberty, they're not talking about the rights and wrongs of violence. They're talking about the principles of that what the army successfully upheld was both liberty and equality. And if they have to, they must carry on. They must maintain those principles for the revolution to succeed. So they're absolutely not outside of the state, and they're not at that point pacifist, I don't think. I think what they do, this is me being very, I think what they do perhaps is to use language of sort of apocalyptic violence, that if you don't do this, the Lord will smite you down. So,
right.
And they use that, I think, as a language of threat. So that there is a violence in their language, but I don't want to say they hide behind the apocalyptic threats of violence, but essentially they are as prophets. They're saying we can't, God will come and get you if you deviate from the path that we all agreed to.
Yeah, I'm well aware of that tradition. Obviously, Jeremiads in the United States have been promising apocalyptic violence for those who have deviated from the way for as long as there has been a United States. I think I don't want to take too much of your time or too much of the listeners' time. I think that's what I wanted to cover, and I think all that's left to say. Is there anything else you wanted to add on this idea of the Quakers and their legacy and the legacy of radicalism in the English Revolution?
So the only bit I would want to add is it kind of again goes back to the centrality for Quakers of being their belief in universal grace, as opposed to sort of Calvinist notion that not everybody is saved, as being fundamental to why I think they're quite a good fit for anarchy. And one of the things they do is they have very organised debates with the ranters. Now, I thought that's quite interesting because there's lots of historians have said ranters don't exist. And they're an invention of various historians and various journalists at the time, but nobody told the Quakers that. So their letters are full of we're going to go, and there's a ranter meeting in Leek. We're going to have to get, and they go regularly to ranter meetings, and they hold formal debates. And they're sensible public sphere debates where they kind of they have an argument, they have an audience, the audience participates. But what the Quakers are trying to do, I mean, I've only got the Quakers side of it, ranters haven't left their letters behind, but it's clear that what the Quakers are trying to do is to explain is to argue with the ranters about the nature of liberty of conscience in a universalist context, and they're imploring both the ranters and their audiences to follow their consciences. So again, it's a deeply anti-hierarchical movement, but they're saying you've got the capacity to discern good and evil. And one of the things that they don't like about the ranters is the ranters appear to be voluntarily embracing sin. Um, and and what the Quakers are saying is, if you know it to be sin, that means that you've got the light of Christ within you, and it's your responsibility not to go down that path. And I thought they were interesting because you don't normally see the nature of kind of quite sustained theological engagement between Ranters and Quakers. They've been reduced to kind of Punch and Judy, kind of, religious radicals in the English Revolution. But actually that there is a debate about discernment and people kind of following their own understanding in order to have liberty. And often when they talk about understanding, they use the word conscience. But I think in that sense, for me, that speaks to a sense of responsibility that is crucial. That is, for me, that's more easy to imagine if you're not a Calvinist, in the sense that everybody has got a shared responsibility, rather than that having been a predestined decision, a preordained decision about who will be saved or not be saved. It requires everybody to make a discernment, to make a sort of a reasoned or a judgment about good and evil, which I think is a very important. Certainly, the way the Quakers use it in their meetings with the Ranters is a kind of fundamental to how we're going to organise our society. So that's the only bit of, after our last podcast, that was the thing I was kind of thinking through, actually.
Yeah, no, well, I think that universality and its connection to equality is perfect and does fit quite well into the legacy of anarchism. And it's where it does seem like you see them differ from certain other radical groups. So that's wonderful. I think, with your approval, I think I'm going to leave the radical groups here. I'm hoping listeners to have episodes on sort of the poetic legacy of the revolution in John Milton. And of course, the most anti-anarchist thinker of all time, Thomas Hobbes, also comes out of the English Revolution. So I think we'll be talking about a couple of these unfortunately great men, but the Quakers are going to be our last radical group. I think that's appropriate, Kate. Does that sound appropriate to you?
I'm very happy with that. Yeah, that's fine.
All right, very good. All right, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Okay, thank you very much.